Hi and welcome. This week I'm going to be changing the steering head bearings on my Benelli 1130 TnT. When I recently had the front wheel out to change the front tyre, I did notice that there was a bit of a notch in the steering. What I mean by that is that when I turned the forks from the left to the right from the centre position, there was a little bit of resistance that I had to overcome. And this is quite a common problem with steering head bearings when they get old. The actual balls in the steering head bearing assembly do develop flat spots so that you get that a little bit of initial resistance, which can lead to weave if the condition actually is quite pronounced. On my particular bike, I didn't actually notice any difference in the handling, but I did notice a little bit of brake shudder under certain braking conditions that I couldn't track down to anything else. So I thought it was time to change the bearings. Now I've already removed the forks from my bike. If you're interested in knowing how to do that, you can see part of that job in removing the front wheel. I'll put a link to that video in the description below. Once the front wheel and the calipers are off, it's actually pretty straightforward to remove the front mudguard and slide the forks out of the triple clamps. Now, removing the triple clamp assembly itself from the headstock here is a little bit more involved and does require a couple of special tools. Now, I've actually taken the triple clamps off. So we'll go over the bench and I'll show you what's required to remove those triple clamps, what the bearings look like and what the special tools are. Well, here's the steering head assembly here. Obviously, after you've removed the forks, you need to remove the handlebars. Now, the main retaining bolt at the top here is actually a Torx bolt, but you can use a 16mm hex key to get it off. Now, this isn't very tight, of course, because I've just loosely assembled this. I'll just take this bolt out. This is actually an alloy bolt. And now you should be able to remove the top triple clamp. And on top here we have a lock nut, and underneath the main headstock tensioning nut. Now the lock nut is a Castle nut, and for that you'll need a special tool such as this, which fits over the headstock into that and allows you to undo that locking Castle nut. So you take that off. Now this is a tricky one. This is actually an alloy nut and it has 7 flats on it, so it's actually quite an unusual size. And there's a factory special tool of which this is sort of like a close replica, which has the 7 segments in it, and that fits over, that sits into those slots and allows you to undo that nut. So without those special tools, it's not really an easy job to remove this nut, and being alloy, you do run the risk of damaging the nut if you use a substitute tool. You might be able to get away with a pin spanner, but I suspect that the alloy is fairly soft and that really you'd be better off making up a special tool. I'll put some basic measurements in the description below just to show you what the size of that special tool is. In fact, what both of them are, if you so desire to make up something yourself. So once you've got that off, you should be able to then drop this through the headstock, and then that will also bring off the outer race. There's a dust cover obviously over the top, and then there's the outer race that sits on here, and you can see it's actually got a plastic cage on this one. Now the lower race here will just pop off, and you will have to use, I've actually been using a pin punch under the edge of the dust cover, and actually this lower race assembly actually does come off relatively easily. Now the actual shaft here is also alloy, so you need to be careful what you do. You really don't want to mark it or damage it in any way. It's certainly not going to be as robust as steel. The whole assembly is really very light. I mean, the steering head assembly and the forks on this bike are actually quite light and certainly typical of a sports bike of that era. So that's really the easy part of the job. apart from obviously requiring these two special tools. Now the hard part of the job is actually removing the outer races from the headstock themselves. So we'll move back to the bike and I'll let you have a look at how the outer races fit in there and what I propose to do about removing them. We can see the outer race here. It's actually pressed into the top of the steering stem assembly. There's also one in the bottom as well. Now in the past on older bikes, these were actually reasonably easy to get out. They usually had a lip on the edge of this outer race and you could just use a pin punch from below or from above and just gradually knock them out by running the pin punch round the inside of the lip. Unfortunately, like a lot of modern bikes, there is no lip on this, and the only way to get this outer race out is really to shrink it. And we can shrink it by running a bead of weld around the race, and then it should come out quite easily. Now I've only got an old school arc welder, which is a little heavy duty for a fine job like this. So I've ordered a MIG welder and I'll be practicing with that for a while before I attempt this job, because I'm not that familiar with MIG welding myself. But once the MIG welder arrives and I've done a bit of a practice, I'll be running some bead around here and taking these outer races out. In part 2 of the video, I'll be fitting the new outer races and then assembling the headstock assembly. I've actually opted for a roller bearing conversion kit. The bike came with ball bearings here, but roller bearings do provide a much longer service life. So I'm going to be replacing these original ball bearings with roller bearings, but that'll be in part 2 of this video. One other thing I should mention before we finish up is that if you're going to do any welding around a modern motorcycle, it is worthwhile disconnecting and removing any delicate electronic components. I've removed the dash off my TnT and I'll also be removing the ECU from under the seat. Welding does generate quite intense magnetic fields, and that can induce electrical currents in the frame and also in the wiring, which can damage sensitive electronic components. So it is worthwhile disconnecting and removing any sensitive components before you do any welding. Well, I think that's about it for this part 1 of replacing the steering head bearings in a Benelli 1130 TnT. I'm not quite sure when part 2 will be completed. Our mail services have been thrown totally into chaos by the COVID pandemic, and my welder has been in the mail for nearly 2 weeks now, and it hasn't left the Sydney depot, which was close to the shop that I bought it from. So I'm not quite sure when it will arrive. Other after effects of COVID really have been, since the Delta variant has hit Australia, we have been limited to first 5, 10 and 15 kilometres radius from home here in Melbourne. And that's really just been for essential shopping and exercise. So there's not much of a ride you can get in those distances unless you want to go down the shops. And really that does pale after a while. Hopefully once vaccination levels rise a little bit higher and restrictions are eased, we'll be able to get out for a decent ride, particularly now that the weather is starting to improve for our summer season of riding here in Melbourne. Anyway, that's about it for this particular video, and I'll catch you next time.